Hey, listen, if you don't want to be happier, please do not subscribe to this channel. But if you're interested in more joy, check out this clip. Okay, so what excited me about reading your book, G.K. Chesterton, distributism, that the principle that people thrive and are happier when they own their stuff.
Yep.
And by their stuff, I don't just mean that you're being greedy and acquiring things.
Oh, definitely not. Yeah.
When you own the products you're making, the means of distribution, the
means of production,
the ability to have a home, you start to care about where you live, and all the world becomes a better place.
Absolutely.
There's such a disconnect that, especially young adults, you talk about your parish. It's like, my parish.
Yeah.
My what? I have nothing.
Right.
So you really in your book, and I think in your whole approach, you identify a problem, an itch that's scratched by distributism. Describe the problem that you lay out as being asset poor, and that disenfranchisement and the despair it leads to. Where does this come from? How is it getting worse and worse?
Yeah.
And then
so
we'll
I think
the solution.
The simple way of thinking about this is to think back to the time in which you and I grew up. Right. I grew up in the 70s. And, people, the middle class owned stuff. They owned homes. They owned businesses. They had prospering main streets. They owned trucks. They owned tools, right? We had an ownership class. What we used to call, at the time of the founding and in Great Britain, a yeoman class, right? Small holders is what they used to be called.
Yeah.
Increasingly, that has gone away. We've moved much more toward a state corporate model, gigantic administrative state and gigantic corporations in league with one another, which, by the way, the original definition of fascism was state corporate economic model. And we've been moving more and more toward that over the past 30 years. There are a lot of reasons for that. I talk about these in the manuscript. I mean, one reason is international trade, particularly with China, has really harmed small business. It's really harmed our manufacturing base, right? So we built the middle class really on 4 industries: retail, construction, farming, and manufacturing, high-wage manufacturing jobs. And we gutted a lot of that, largely through trade with China. So we've had trade policy that's done a lot to erode the middle class. Technology, right? Technology has been a major factor, especially recently. It used to be that capital augmented labor, right? Complemented labor. So the more capital you had, well, what was capital? Manufacturing capital, plants and equipment, right? The more capital you had, the more productive workers were, and the higher were wages. Now, so much of our capital is intangible, and in particular, software or AI that actually competes with labor, right? And so we're in a place now where some capital, physical capital, still complements labor. Other types of capital, intangible capital, in many of its forms, competes with labor and drives down wages. So, whole host of things, many systemic, monetary policy, I talk about that too, right? By pushing interest rates down to 5,000-year lows, people can't benefit from saving. So we're destroying thrift, right? And so that too destroys ownership. So we've been destroying ownership for 30 years. And that's a bad thing, because ownership is really kind of the first baby step toward virtue. Richard Weaver talks about this. Yeah, so there's a great political thinker called Richard Weaver. He had a famous book called Ideas Have Consequences, and in I think it's chapter 9 of that book, the chapter 9 is entitled "Property: The Last Metaphysical Right." And his
last metaphysical right.
Yes, and his main point is that property imprints on the soul. Ownership imprints on the soul. Why? Because if you own something, it demands something of you, right? It imposes psychic costs on you when you let it decay, right? And so it's one of these things, ownership, property ownership, that engenders virtue. And as we know, grace perfects nature, right? The theological virtues happen on top of the natural virtues, right? And so property is very, very important to the natural virtues.
So you start to invest in protecting what you have. And again,
most skin in the game.
Right, you get skin in the game. Most people think that's leading to greed. No, it's leading to me turning outside of myself.
Exactly. It's funny you say it that way, because Weaver also talks about that. That it turns the soul, instead of inward, outward. So
you know, just like every vice leads to some kind of slavery.
servitude, yes.
Right? Not turning outside of myself in that way, and having a world where you don't own anything, where you're not taking care of anything. I mean, we got those young adults who are in six figures. They're renting their houses. They don't have CDs. I mean, it's just a stupid example. Literally everything is just temporary, owned by the cloud, owned by someone else. And it leads to what you describe as a new kind of serfdom.
Yeah, it's a new serfdom. That's exactly
How is
right.
that?
Well, so you know, I have a friend who likes to say that younger generations are very similar to Russian serfs. Better fed, better clothed, but they don't own anything, right? Think about this sort of globalist thesis where we say to younger generations, you're not going to own anything, but you'll be happy. The opposite is true. If you don't own anything, eventually it leads to unhappiness. And you know, by eroding asset ownership and moving more and more toward asset poverty, we're moving more and more toward a society that's less and less happy. It's less and less equal. We have a smaller and smaller middle class, and it's more and more divided.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say this idea of asset poverty is a very important one. You brought it up earlier. And the idea is that one of the most important ways we should be measuring poverty is based upon ownership, you know, ownership of assets. And if you take the middle 60%, you know, you rank Americans on asset ownership, and you just take the middle 60%, which is a working definition of the middle class. The net worth of the middle 60% is just extremely low and getting lower all the time. And that's asset poverty. You know, less and less ownership.
And we'll be happy, well-fed serfs. I was reading an article the other day. Showed a really extreme example of this. I have a lot of good friends good Catholic friends in Hawaii. The island of Lanai, right? It's capitalism that's spun out of control. You got people who have lived there for 700 years in these islands. Larry Ellison now owns 98% of an island.
Jeez, yeah.
And no one elected the dude. A third of the housing he owns. He owns all the industry. So people are working for him and then giving him money back to rent the houses from him. He owns the grocery stores. He owns the news outlets.
You know, it's like the old factory town, right?
Exactly, right?
The old mining towns where the mining company owned it all. Right? It's a form of serfdom. Right? And now, of course, you see large private equity firms going around the country, buying, in some cases, entire neighborhoods of single-family homes to convert them into rental neighborhoods. I mean, what are we doing? It's like post-Victorian England, right? I mean,
it's crazy.
It makes no sense.
Wasn't that great? Listen, I never want you to miss out on these amazing conversations and these amazing teachings by yours truly. So here's what you do. Take the subscribe button and just grab it with authority and rub it in the face of your Bible, or however you want to do this. As long as you hit subscribe and you'll never miss this content, be sure to share it with everybody you know. God bless you. We'll see you in the next video.